How do you handle a bully? Well, I'll tell you how I handled the bully once. There was a neighborhood bully that he would come out and play with us every now and then. We used to play baseball on the street with a tennis ball. And this bully had come down the street, and a bunch of us were like, uh-oh, be on your best behavior. And so bully came down and joined us, didn't ask, just joined us to play. And so we were playing some baseball together, and I thought I was going to teach this bully a lesson. And so I saw an old dried up pine cone at the side of the road, and I said to the bully, I bet you can't pick up that pine cone and throw it to the house that far. I can too. And he picked it up, and he whipped it as far as he could, and easily got past the house. And then I started to laugh and snicker, and we all started to laugh as I broke the news to him that wasn't a pine cone. It was dog feces. And yes, it was pretty quiet. I know. I hesitated to tell this story. I'm surprised the kids aren't laughing too. But you'll see the point of where I'm going with this. In my mind, I was a hero. I stood up to the bully, and the bully was embarrassed, and all my friends, we were all laughing as kids, and I had a good chuckle in my mind, and I thought, I taught this bully a lesson. Well, it didn't end there. I won't continue. The bully didn't physically hurt me, but he did take my baseball bat and damaged my baseball bat and got a little retribution that way. But he went home kind of insulted and didn't, of course he was embarrassed. How would Jesus have handled the situation? Now, this is way before my family and I, before I came to church, and this is like, this is how I was as a kid and living in the world, and this is what you did to bullies. How would Jesus handle a bully? Well, it happened at one time, to many of the Jews, the Samaritans were kind of like bullies. As a matter of fact, the Samaritans, and these were neighbors to the Jews, they used to be a part of the Jewish people. The Samaritans, they were once Jews that they were separated. The Jewish people were taken into captivity, and the captors brought people from their nation and planted them where some of the remaining Jews lived, and they intermarried, and they brought their own religions, and they became known as the Samaritans because they were in the region of Samaria. And I'm going to give a little bit of history. Here's one of the Samaritans when the Jews were finally released, and they were sent back, and they were able to rebuild their temple. This is how those bullies responded. Here's Sanballat, one of the leaders of the Samaritans, and there they are. And they say, what are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble? And then someone else says, indeed, even if a fox climbed up what they're building, he would break down their stone wall. And they're laughing and they're mocking. That's what Nehemiah recorded, and the Jews were well aware of this in Jesus' time. And of course, Ezra records that when the people returned and they were ready to rebuild, the people of the land, they made them afraid to build. They also bribed officials to act against them and frustrate their plans throughout the region. So they tried to make it difficult for the Jewish people. They were a bit of a bully. Now the Samaritans, here's Samaria. Now Jesus did most of his ministry around the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee up there. And here's where Jesus died. Here's where he lived most of his life, up in Nazareth. And you could see Samaria as this region in between. So whenever the Jews had to travel down, because several times a year you had to go to Jerusalem for one of the festivals and whatnot, you would have to, if you wanted the quickest route, you'd go right through Samaria. But Josephus records, he was an early historian, he records that there was actually violent clashes between the Jews and the Samaritans. See, the Samaritans, they had a different Bible. They used the same Pentateuch, it's called the Samaritan Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in their 10 commandments, they had an extra commandment in there. And they said that God wanted us to build an altar on Mount Gerizim. And so here's your Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and you're looking right in between the two is Sychar there, and Mount Gerizim's where they were supposed to put their altar. The Samaritans went as far as saying, Jerusalem is not the place for the temple. The temple should be on Mount Gerizim. And so what they did is they built a big temple there in about 500 BC or BCE, however you want to look at that. So they had their own instructions, their own way of worship. They had their own way of doing things. And the Jews were wrong in their eyes. So the Jewish people, if you wanted to come down to Jerusalem, you would go way around. The quickest route would be maybe 3 days. They would add an extra 3 to 4, maybe sometimes 5 days to their journey just to avoid Samaria. I don't know about you. If 3 days worth versus 5 or 6 or 7 days, I'm like, I'd rather take the 3. It would have to be something very, very scary for me to avoid that region, or threatening, and so many of them did. Most of them did. Except Jesus. Jesus was actually kind to them. Jesus treated them differently than the rest of the Jewish people did. Jesus actually, he often went straight through the Samaritan territory. Do you remember on right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we read this in John chapter 4, where it said he had to go through Samaria. No, he didn't have to go through Samaria. There were routes around it. But in his mind, he had to go through there, and there was a reason. Because he had to meet that woman at the well. Not only was she a Samaritan, a part of this group of people who were, there was a lot of animosity and hatred against the Jews, but she was actually a great sinner as a part of that population. She was cheating on her husband. She wasn't living a good life. And Jesus met her. And Jesus brings the message to her. See, the Samaritans were also waiting for the Messiah. And the Messiah came and introduced himself first to her. He was kind to the Samaritans. And do you remember Jesus told the story to the Jews? Who's your neighbor? He uses a Samaritan as the good guy, as the good Samaritan, the good neighbor who would help, who would stop to help you if you were in trouble. And the Jews would have been like, what? What are you talking about? Jesus was kind to the Samaritans. And another time when he had to go through Samaria, he passed through Samaria, and there were these 10 lepers, these 10 individuals with these skin diseases, and they came to Jesus to be healed, and Jesus healed them. One of them came back, and it specifically says he was a Samaritan. And Jesus says, your faith has saved you. You're welcome to come to me. Jesus had friends amongst the Samaritans. Jesus was welcome amongst the Samaritans. After he met the woman at the well, she went and told them everything. And he went through their villages, healing them and staying with them. He was known to the Samaritans. And he even died for the Samaritans. And he had the gospel, the good news, sent to the Samaritans. Now, some of you might say, well, not at first. When he sent his disciples out before he died, he sent them to just the Israelites, to the Jewish nation, not to the Gentiles and not to the Samaritans in Matthew chapter 10. But you'll recall, because salvation was coming from the Jews, he was starting his ministry with the Jews, and he wasn't forgetting about them. He was just saying they would come next. Started with the Jews, and then what? The gospel spread to the Samaritans next, and then to the Gentiles and the ends of the earth. And so we read this as he sends them out in the book of Acts. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And that's kind of how the gospel spread. Samaria wasn't forgotten. It was actually right after the Jewish people down in Judea. So Jesus was kind to the Samaritans. Jesus probably had a lot of friends that were Samaritans. So the question remains, why then in Luke chapter 9, did they not welcome Jesus into their village? Because we read this in Luke chapter 9. When the days were coming to a close, when he was coming near the end of his ministry, he sent messengers ahead of him And they entered the village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him, but they did not welcome him. Why? Because he had determined to journey to Jerusalem. Jesus, you should not be going to Jerusalem. You should be worshiping Mount Gerizim. Jerusalem's not the place. Maybe that was their idea. Were they wrong? It would be a short time after this where Jesus was killed when he went to Jerusalem. Maybe many of his friends said, if only he had listened to us, we were right. Maybe they had this attitude. We don't know. What we do know is that James and John were so angry with them. How could you? How could you do this to Jesus? Now, they didn't say that. What it says is they said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them? Lord, let us destroy them and teach them a lesson so all the other Samaritans will hear about it and they'll treat you with more dignity and kindness that you deserve. After all, Jesus was kind to them. Why should they be rude back to him? And so this is the situation in Luke chapter 9. But Jesus says to them, he says he turned and he rebuked them. He says, you're wrong. And then Jesus walked away. They just went to another village. You see, when you start to look at bullies from a different perspective, when you start to look at bullies from the view of God, and of course that's why there wasn't laughter, and that's good that a lot of you weren't laughing. That says you have good hearts. Because when I was trying to teach that bully a lesson, if there was a new neighbor that didn't know that person was a bully, who would have looked like the bully that day? Me. I was actually being a bully to that person. And you know what's interesting is here's these Samaritans who look like bullies, but guess what? From God's point of view, the Jewish people actually began the problem. You see, we left some passages out in Ezra. This is what we read, that they discouraged the people and they bribed the officials against them. We didn't read the beginning. We didn't read what happened before that. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building the temple, when the Jewish people had returned, they approached them and they said, let us build it with you so that we can work together. We can worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the king of Assyria brought us here. So in other words, I'm going to paraphrase this. You're back. We're with you. We're your people. Let us rejoin you. You were taken away to captivity. They left us behind. They put all these other people here for us to marry and get confused in our religion. We want to join you again. And the Jewish people, the leaders said, no, you're not one of us. You're not welcome. And we see that it was even an insult to be a Samaritan. You see, Jesus was accused once of being demon-possessed, and they put it in the same category as being a Samaritan. So it's not a one-sided coin here of who's the bully. And even that temple that the Samaritans had built in 500, do you know the Jewish people destroyed that temple? And so there's some of the remains from the temple. And so, who's the bully? Jesus would tell us, before you begin to take the speck of dust out of someone else's eye, what? Take the plank out of your own eye. Look at it from God's perspective and start to have a different attitude toward those people around us. Start to show some mercy. Start to show some compassion. Start to show some forgiveness. Isn't that what Jesus taught? He turned to them and he rebuked them and went to another village. And perhaps he reminded them along the way that they are to do good to their enemies, as he had already taught. And we have this recorded in Matthew chapter 5. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and what? Pray for those who persecute you. I wonder how many Samaritans from that village were in their prayers that day. I wonder if Jesus that night got down on his knees and prayed for that village to set an example to the rest of the disciples, to James and John about how you treat your enemies, how you treat those who are harsh to you, who persecute you, who mistreat you, who aren't kind to you, who annoy you, who frustrate you. And there might be a lot of people in that category, and there might be a lot of people in that category who, once you've treated them differently, have changed to become some of our closest friends. As a matter of fact, if you're reading in the New Testament, 13 of those books written in that New Testament were written by not just a bully, but a murderer of Christians. The Apostle Paul, or known as Saul, who's known as Paul, who wrote those letters and those books and became one of the greatest proponents for Christianity that we see. He called himself the 13th disciple. James told them, judgment is without mercy to the one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. If you're going to err on a side, err on the side of mercy. And of course, when Peter says about forgiveness, we're going to come back to that one in a minute. Sorry, this is the one with the speck in your eye. Matthew chapter 7. Take the plank out of your own eye before taking the speck out of someone else's eye. And of course, this is one I was thinking. When Peter says, how many times do I need to forgive? And the Lord begins and he tells this story of the unmerciful servant. Over and over and over, Jesus talked about mercy, about love, about forgiveness. And that unmerciful servant, that one man who had such a great debt, and the king forgave his debt, and he went out and he found someone who owed just a little bit of money, and he threatened him, and he strangled him, he threatened him, and had him put in prison. And the king heard about this and said, do you not realize, and began paraphrasing, how much you've been forgiven, and this is how you treat others? And so, what are we doing for our enemies? What are we doing for those people who we think deserve punishment? We have this idea of what justice is, and you can see that if you look online, you can see some of these videos, so-and-so gets what's coming to them, gets what they deserve, and on and on. You see these videos, and people are laughing at that, and something bad happens to someone who was mean to someone else. We have this idea of what justice is, but remember, we're not God. God knows everything. So maybe we ought to take a step back and remember that we're to be different from the world. We're to love our enemies and pray for them. Maybe write a card to someone who you haven't wanted to talk to. They frustrated you. Maybe they've tried to make peace with you. Jesus said, forgive them. If they come to you and ask for forgiveness, you forgive them. But some of us, we just can't let things go. We have to remember God is a just God, and let God have the final say in justice. And don't give up on people. Put yourself in their shoes. That one verse I was showing you, when the people said, you can't be one of us. I wonder what would have happened if the Jewish people said, let's sit down and have a conversation. Maybe we can talk about this. Because it wasn't their fault, the Samaritans' fault, that they were left behind. It wasn't their fault that they were the ones that were left behind and they weren't taken. They probably would have said, well, it would have been better if we were taken in captivity. Jesus knows this. God knows this. And so God wants us to pray for our enemies, be kind to them, put ourselves in their shoes, be full of forgiveness and love and mercy, and have a God's eye view. I was going to show this video this morning, but I thought I'd just reference it. Some of you may have seen this video going around the internet. And the video shows this guy driving down the road. Kurt was talking about driving and whatnot. And this guy's driving down the road really slow. And someone's behind him and he's honking the horns like, get out of the way, come on, what's your problem? And angry. That could be any one of us. And then it shows this other lady, she's in a store, and her little one is breaking down and just having all kinds of problems. And these two ladies are at the counter, and one says, can you believe it? She doesn't know how to take care of her kid. And then all of a sudden it flashes back to what happened hours earlier. She's in an office fostering a child. You see, this child has a lot of problems. It's going to be really hard. And don't worry, we'll show her lots of love. And then hours later, it shows the guy who was driving. And he's in the hospital. And the doctor said, I'm sorry, she's passed away. And he thinks, how am I going to tell my kids? And he's driving home, and he can't figure out how he's going to tell his kids. And that's our problem when it comes to judgment. That's our problem when it comes to mercy. We want good judgment and good mercy for ourselves, but we have a problem giving it to others. And so we remember Jesus would say, with the measure you judge others, you will be judged. We remember James saying, mercy triumphs over judgment. And blessed are the merciful. And Jesus wants us also to be peacemakers. So may God help us to put ourselves in his shoes, to look at people of the world as he does, to not give up on any one person, because every person is valuable in the eyes of God. And if you have a problem with someone, if you don't want to talk to someone, and you have a problem, you can still pray for them, and you can still ask someone else to go and help them. Because I guarantee you that God wants someone to be helping those people. The problem people of this world, they need God. Maybe more than we think, right? That person really needs God. Yes, they do. And what are you doing about it? May God help us to have a heart of love, a heart of patience, a heart of peace, a heart of grace, and a heart of mercy. Because when we think we look at others as the bully, God reminds us it's not them that's the bully, it's not them that's the problem, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we need God's mercy on that day that he returns. Let's stand for our final song.